When we started this series, Zombie Life, a couple weeks ago, our lead pastor, Carl, gave you a disclaimer and said that he's not a zombie person. Well, I'm preaching today, and I'm going to give you a disclaimer and let you know I am a zombie person. That's right. I think zombie movies are pretty tight. I don't like the guts, but the adventure of it, it's pretty exhilarating. I think it's cool. Some friends of mine even kind of imagine hypothetically if the zombie apocalypse happened, like where would we go and how would we survive and all that stuff. And that leads me to one of the more interesting things about our culture and how we view the zombie apocalypse. When we watch those movies or even imagine what it would be like, hypothetically, we always assume that we'd survive. Like we always picture ourselves in a certain circumstance and say, oh yeah, we'd make it, we'd be okay. Truth is, no, you wouldn't. You wouldn't make it. You wouldn't last 5 minutes. And that's just not an insult, that's on me too. Half the people here need their iPhones to get to the nearest Trader Joe's. What makes you think that you're gonna survive if a Rundle Mills got infected with zombies and they came chomping at you like a T-Rex? What evidence is there that you would really make it, like for real? And here's another thing about the zombie apocalypse that always interests me. Everyone in those movies or in the TV shows, everyone always has like the perfect set of skills. They're always like way too convenient. Like whenever there's a group of people that are trying to survive in the woods or something, there's always that one guy who's a master tracker and hunter. Like he can hunt anything. And then there's always one person who's a chemistry teacher on the side, but they're an ex-surgeon in real life. And so when you break your femur, they can like stitch it all back up in your square. And then in every movie, it seems like there's one person who's completely worthless, the whole movie. But then at the end, you realize, oh, they're in the film and they're part of this crew because they're cousins with the president, and they get hooked up at the end and they get rescued. And it's just so unrealistic. Never mind the fact that it's a zombie apocalypse. It's just unrealistic to say that these people would be equipped for something that ridiculous. But I started to think about our series today and this idea of being equipped, and I realized we live in a culture where you're constantly being told, get more education, get more training, get more equipped. There are things that you can do to be prepared for everything that's going to come your way in your career and in your life. But the truth is, and you know this is true, there are just some things in your life that you are not equipped to handle. There are some things that have happened in your life where you just don't even have a vocabulary for it. There's no way you could have been prepared for it. And that's something we're going to talk about today is do we have to suffer from being people who aren't equipped for what life has to throw at us, or is there something bigger there? Is there something more for us to be able to be equipped to handle the things that come our way? Because the truth is, there are people here right now who are visiting Mosaic for the first time because this past week, life threw something at them they didn't know how to handle. They felt inequipped. And they decided, all right, someone once mentioned church was a good thing, so I'm going to go to church and see if God's got anything for me. And whether you're here today for that reason or you came 6 months ago because that happened to you, you're not alone. And we're really glad you're here. We think this is a great place for you to be. Because the reality is there are people in this room who are so overwhelmed by the circumstances in their life that tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and spend an hour on your smartphone looking at other people's lives on social media because you're so dissatisfied with your own. And there are people in this room who have someone in their family who's dying, or maybe there's family conflict, and everyone's relying on you to be the source of reconciliation and support, but you're so busy worrying about their problems that you can't even address the things that you got to deal with. And there are people in this room who are just like me, where life is pretty good. It'd be kind of selfish for you to complain about it, but every day you deal with insecurity, and you deal with anxiety, and you wonder, am I smart enough today? Am I going to be funny enough? Am I going to lead people well enough? Am I going to be creative enough to do what I want to do? Because the truth is, life's hard. We all know that's true. There's stuff in our life that we are just not prepared to handle. But the question we'll ask today is there a way that we could get equipped? What if we were? What if we moved from being people who tread water and just try to make sure we survive in life to move out of that phase where we're crushing it at life, so much so that people see how we're doing and they want to be impacted by what we have to offer? Is that something we could achieve? And I think that is true. I think that's something we can achieve. And so my goal today is that we would become aware of how God has equipped us to handle and overcome our circumstances. That we'd be affirmed in the ways that He's equipped us to handle life. And the last thing, that we'd become action-oriented people. That if we embrace how we've been equipped to handle life, what does it mean to be action-oriented with the things that God's given us? So today, we're going to be in week 3 of our series, Zombie Life. And we got this term from Romans 12. Paul is a guy in the Bible who didn't like Christians at all. Then he bumped into Jesus and he became a Christian. And he writes a letter to Christians in Rome. And that's where we get the book of Romans from. And in chapter 12, he begins his whole letter to the Romans saying that as Christians, we should offer our bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean we should be hurting ourselves or killing ourselves or anything. What it means is, as people who have a relationship with God, we are submitting ourselves to God's authority and other people. So instead of living for ourselves, we're going to live for others. We are living sacrifices. We're the living dead. And that's where we get this term zombie life. And we're going to keep looking at this letter, this one letter Paul writes in Romans 12, and we're going to look at this next chunk in verses 4 through 8. So before we get into it, if you're here today and you've been following Jesus for a while, this is relevant for you. If you are just new to this, then it's really relevant for you because that's who Paul was writing to. He was writing to people who were on the cusp of having a relationship with God or had just been doing it for maybe like 5 minutes. So if you're here, no matter where you are, what Paul's writing about is going to be relevant for you. Here's what he says in verses 4 through 8. He writes, "Just as our bodies have many parts, and each part has a special function, so it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body, and we all belong to each other. In his grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, serve them well. If you are a teacher, teach well. If your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving, give generously. If God has given you the leadership ability, take the responsibility seriously. And if you have the gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly." So what Paul's letter tells us here is that if we have a relationship with God, God gives us something that we didn't have before to help us thrive in this life. Because we say this at Mosaic a lot, having a relationship with Jesus is not just about affecting the outcome of when you die. I wouldn't be interested in that. I'm interested in knowing, how does God affect my life right now? How does he make my life better? How does he give me life to the full? And this is one way that we experience this, what Paul writes about in Romans 12, that when we have a relationship with God, he gives us gifts to succeed in life. And I'm not talking about in finances or in your career. I'm talking about handling all the things that life throws at us. He gives us gifts to handle those things. And so if we're here and we want to transition from being people who are just treading water and hoping another wave doesn't come, if we want to stop being like that and start being like people who are crushing it at life, as I like to say, then we need to be aware of how God has given us gifts. Paul writes that for every person who decides to follow Jesus, everyone who repents, that term just means to about face, do a 180, anyone who does that and has a relationship with God, that they receive a God-powered gift. And that doesn't mean that God's going to put you in situations where you can't feel like you handle it. That may happen. But what it does mean is that he's going to equip you to overcome when you feel overwhelmed. And as you embrace the gifts he's given you, you realize it's not just about fixing yourself or making your life better. It's about how do you impact the lives of those around you. And so I know I'm kind of spitting two different things at you. I'm saying, okay, John, you're saying, these gifts are going to help my life, but I'm also supposed to help others. They sound like two different things. The focal point seems a little opposite here. And here's where it all comes together about being aware of our gifts. If we live the zombie life, we die to ourselves by using our gifts not for me, but for others. And as in, they use the word the body here, in the group of people here, in Mosaic, in the church, if we are using our gifts not for me but for others, and other people are doing the same thing, we benefit from their gifts as we pour out our gifts on them. 1 Peter 4:10 says, "God has given each of you a gift from his great variety of spiritual gifts. Use them well to serve one another." The best illustration for this is probably a really good marriage where you have a husband and his wife, and both are called to submit to each other. But as they're submitting to one another, they're actually being uplifted by the person, their spouse, uplifting them by submitting. And so in the same way with our gifts, as we pour out our gifts for other people, we reap the benefit as they share their gifts with us. Now, in order to be aware of our gifts, we got to know what they are. So let's look at what some of these gifts that are listed in the Bible. A question you may be asking right now is, okay, John, Romans 12 had like 7 of these gifts. Why are there like 50 of them up here? Well, that's a great thing. Throughout the Bible, Paul writes in Romans 1 Corinthians 12 and Ephesians 4, in addition to Romans 12, these are a list of gifts that Paul writes about that we receive from having a relationship with God. The list he says in Romans 12 is not an exhaustive list. It's just a section of what he writes about in the larger context of the New Testament. And so let's look at some of these. We got prophecy, serving, teaching, encouraging, leadership, wisdom, healing, pastoring, hospitality, evangelism. That's another word for talking to people about Jesus. Here's the thing about some of these gifts, though. Some of these things on the screen you see are things that we're all called to do for those of us who have a relationship with God. We're all called to serve. We're all called to be encouraging, to show mercy, to talk to people about Jesus. We're called to be hospitable. But when you have a God-given gift, as Paul writes in Romans 12, that means that you have a very real ability to be better at these things than other people. That God's given you a gift to be better at some of these things than anyone else you may know. And so if you're here and you don't have no idea what your gifts are, if you're hearing me and you're like, John, this sounds nuts, I don't even know which one of these things are me, here are two practical things that you can do to learn and be aware of what your spiritual gifts are. Number one is I think that you should write all these down either now or when you go home. Look up 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12, and Ephesians 4, and list all the spiritual gifts that Paul writes about, and just pray. Put them on a journal, put them on a piece of paper, and say, God, I have no idea which ones I am inclined to have a gift for, which ones you've given me. I need you to help me understand which of these gifts are mine. The second thing you can do is find 2 to 3 people in your life that you admire, who know you really well, and give them absolute access to speak in your life. Say, look at this list, which ones do you see in me? And that may be dangerous because they may tell you stuff that you don't want to hear, or you may think you have a gift that you don't have. We'll get into that in a second. But that's a great way to learn what gifts you might have. And here's the last thing I'll say about being aware of our spiritual gifts. This is my opinion now. I think out of our greatest struggles comes the opportunity for our most influential gifts. I think out of the greatest struggles in our lives comes the opportunity for our most influential gifts. If you battled alcoholism in your life, and now you're free of that addiction, it's probably not a coincidence that you may have the spiritual gift of counseling so you can help people the way that you were never helped during your difficult time. If you suffered abuse or neglect as a child, it may not be a coincidence that you have the gift of encouragement so you can give to others what you never got as a kid. It's not by accident. I think out of our greatest struggles comes the opportunity for our most influential gifts. And the reason being aware of our gifts really matters is because it helps us overcome our circumstances and it unleashes us to be a part of God's mission, which I believe with all my heart is the greatest thing we could ever be a part of. It's the greatest thing we could ever be a part of. Some of you know my wife is a flight attendant for Southwest Airlines, and when she got the job, she had to leave me for 5 weeks straight. And we've been married for a year, and any guys in here who are married, and whenever your wife leaves, everyone looks at you like a sick puppy. They kind of just take pity on you. They assume you eat cereal for dinner, which I did all the time. But when she was gone, I had to pass the time in some pretty unique ways. You get tired of Netflix. There's only so much Netflix you can take. So a friend of mine recommended that I decide to make a top 50 movie list, where I list my top 50 favorite movies of all time. And not only that, he said, put them in numerical order. I had nothing else to do, so I did it. And I'm going to let you in on a very intimate part of my life. I'm going to let you in on my top 5 movies on my top 50 movie list. So let's do this real quick. Number 1, Forrest Gump. Love it. Come on. Number 2, Braveheart. Duh. Number 3, Shawshank Redemption. When he's in the rain and there's just Morgan Freeman, he just talks over you. It's great. Number 4 is Schindler's List. It got real quiet all of a sudden. It's a great movie. It's obviously really sad, but it's a great movie. And number 5, Star Wars, Return of the Jedi. Duh. I got a fist bump in the back. All right. Here's the thing. I know Empire Strikes Back is a better movie in and of itself, but I love the redemption Return of the Jedi, so if you have an opinion that alters with that, we can have a discussion or maybe have a little nerd convention in the lobby. That's okay. We can do that. I just love Return of the Jedi. But here's the thing about these movies, and a lot of the movies on my list. Braveheart was based on real things, and Schindler's List is a real story. But most of the movies on my top 50 list aren't real. They're not real. But with our gifts that we have, I believe with all my heart that what God has called you to today is better than fiction. It's better than fiction. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we want to grow old watching someone live a life behind a lens? Or do you want to be a part of something that's real? Because if you have a real gift that can impact people's lives, are we going to do something about it? We got to be aware that we have real gifts, and the next step to overcoming our circumstances is to be affirmed in what those gifts are. Have you ever tried to solve a problem that you had no business solving? Maybe like building IKEA furniture? You know. Well, this happened to a friend of mine, Mike. He's the guy who did the announcements up here a couple minutes ago. Mike lives in a townhome down the street from me, and he moved in a couple months ago, and Mike found a live bat living in his bedroom. And Mike is not an animal person. Mike, how do I put this? If Mike was a cat, he's what we call an indoor cat. And, I mean, when Mike sees a deer out of place, he goes, ew, go back to the woods. He hates animals. He does not jive with them. And so we found this bat, and he calls me and says, John, there's a bat in my room. You got to come help me. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't help. And I hung up, and I realized, what am I thinking? I got to go watch this. So I throw on a bicycle helmet, a windbreaker jacket, some gloves, and I grab a broom, and I run down the street to help my friend Mike at like 9:30 at night. And neither of us have any idea what we're doing. He's more scared than I am, but I'm just trying to be tough, but I'm scared at the same time. And so I get in there. Actually, I think we have a photo of we were ready to go. So I get in there, and Mike's like crouched on the stairs watching this bat swoosh around his bedroom. And we come up with a plan, and we close the door, make the plan, and we go back in, and we can't find the bat. And luckily for you, what happened next, my friend Ange was videotaping, so here's what happened. All right, Mike, I need you to stay in car.
Open it.
I'm trying.
Oh, my.
Where is it?
I was so scared. If it's in the blinds, I'm going to lose my mind. You just block my back.
I'm so scared right now that I've never been more scared in my life. I've never.
Get that bat.
It sucks blood. That's what bats do.
It's a little vampire bat.
Dude, where did it go?
Look at his face. Oh. So we couldn't find the bat, and I was of no use. I had to go back to whatever it is I was working on, so I left. And Mike's other roommate, Sean, had arrived, and Sean's from Tennessee, so we kind of assumed that he would know how to handle a wild animal, but he didn't know either, and here's what happened.
You got it.
You did?
I'm tired of it. Sean, you got
God,
it. Just go
she
there and
is
slap
such a
as
creep.
hard as you want.
No, dude, he's probably dripping blood on my stuff.
No, he's not. He's good.
Here's where Mike manned up.
It came scooping at me. That broom broke.
Oh. Give it up for Mike. Yeah, Mike. Woo! I've seen that 50 times, and I never get tired of it. Man, Mike and I had no business being exterminators. We had no idea what we were doing. And this is a funny story, but we do this all the time. We try to do stuff that we're not equipped to do, and we fail. And we do it with our gifts. We try to solve problems or use gifts that God never gave us, and in turn, we fail. We feel underutilized, and we feel ineffective. And if you're anything like me, you blame God after you fail. For some reason, as people, we always seem to want the gifts that someone else has, and instead, we miss out on the work that God has uniquely designed you to be a part of. We miss out because we want what other people have, or we think we have this gift and we don't, and in the process, we miss out on the great work that God can call us to. When I first became a Christian, I thought I had a lot of gifts. I thought I had the gift of hospitality and faith and wisdom. I thought I had a lot of these things, but I learned that I don't realize what gifts I don't have until I meet someone who actually has them. I don't realize what gifts I don't have until I meet someone who actually has the gift of hospitality. I used to think I was good at being hospitable, and then I went to someone's house and they made me feel like royalty, and I realized Doritos and pizza does not count as hospitality. I used to think I had the gift of faith until I met someone who's going through an incredibly difficult time, and they were clinging to God in a way that I don't think I could have during that circumstance. And I realized I don't have the gift of faith. I have faith, but it's not a gift. And for so long, I have wanted the gift of wisdom. I wish I was a wise person. I wish I could sit in a room and be in the back and be quiet the whole time and then at the end, drop some truth bomb on everybody and be like, wisdom, what up? I wish that was me, but if you know me, you know that's not me. There's a verse in Proverbs that says, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. That is my life. I say dumb stuff. I'm like, anytime I open my mouth, it's like, not wisdom. Now, that doesn't mean that I should be unwise, but it means that wisdom is just not a gift of mine. And that's okay. God didn't give me the gift of wisdom, and I need to understand and to value and appreciate and know that there's a reason he didn't give me that. But what I do have is a gift of evangelism to talk to people about Jesus practically, and I have the gift of leadership. So I need to get out of the way, stop trying to do things that I'm not wired to do, and let other people impact the world in a way that I simply can't. And be a part of the things that God uniquely designed me to be a part of. What I'm trying to say is that with you and with me, God did not make a mistake when he gave you the gifts he gave you. He did not make a mistake. And when we doubt the gifts we've been given, when we doubt those, we're doubting the gift giver. We're doubting God. Did you ever get a really bad birthday present from your uncle and just look at the gift and look at your uncle like, you clearly do not know who I am? That's how we act. That's how we are when we have a gift from God and we don't utilize it. We're doubting the gift giver. God did not make a mistake when he chose to give you the gifts he gave you. And a great question to ask right now is, how do we know this is true? How can we believe that? And I think it's in Romans 8, just a couple chapters before Romans 12. Paul writes this: we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. For God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his son. It says God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his son. And what does this mean? It means before you existed, before anything existed, God knew you. Before you even knew him, he knew you, and he loved you, and he had a plan for you, and he had a plan that would shape you in the image of his son Jesus as you participated in God's work. God knew what he was doing when he gave you the gift of counseling. He knew what he was doing when he gave you the gift of administration. It was not a mistake. There's a great purpose that he has for you with the gifts that he's given you. But when we doubt the gifts we have and we're not affirmed in them, it cuts everything off. It makes the gift almost not worth it. Another way I experienced this was when I tried to do the taxes on my own this spring. Big mistake. I worked for Mosaic last year, and when you work for a church, taxes look a little different than when you're just in sort of a regular secular job. So I did my taxes, and at the end of TurboTax, told me I had $4,000 I owed the government. Yikes. Kind of nervous about that, didn't know what to do. And I didn't think it was right, but I'm not a tax professional, I don't understand. So I start talking to my friend Rick at a Green Turtle or something, and I tell Rick, I don't know what to do. I owe this money, and I don't think it's right, but I don't know what to do. And Rick goes, don't worry about it, J-Mo. I have a guy. And anytime someone says they have a guy, I'm a little skeptical. And it doesn't help because Rick had a neck tattoo, and I do not take advice from people with neck tattoos. But Rick said something I won't forget. He said, John, would you let my tax guy get on stage and speak at Mosaic? And I said, don't know him, but probably not. And he said, then why are you trying to do his job? Why are you trying to do his job? And I was like, all right, fine, I'll go. You won me over. I'll go check out your tax guy. And he had a real office. It wasn't sketchy. And he took care of us, and he taught us how our tax thing was off and how we screwed things over a little bit. And we realized that we were actually going to get just a little bit back at the end of the tax system or whatever it's called. And at the time, clearly I shouldn't have been doing my own taxes. And so at the time, my wife and I are like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, we'll get a little bit back. That's great. And we get into our car, and we're like high-fiving, fist-pumping. We went from owing $4,000 to just getting a little bit back. It was great. But the truth is we do that all the time in our lives. We try to do things that we're not equipped to do, and when we fail, we feel underutilized or as if God's not at work in our lives. What we need to do is focus on what we do have, not on what we don't, because that's where you start to make a real impact in the world and in the lives of those around you. We've got to be aware of our gifts, we've got to be affirmed in them, and we've got to be action-oriented. That's the last part, possibly the most important. Paul says in Romans 12 that we're supposed to use our bodies as a living sacrifice. And the reason that's important is because it doesn't say use your minds or use your heart. It says use your bodies. That means your body is physically moving because you are offering it as a living sacrifice. Jesus says as we learn more about him and we give him control of our heart and of our mind, our body moves differently. Here's what James, his brother, wrote in the book of James chapter 1. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, this is the Bible he's talking about, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. And Jesus' own brother here is unapologetic in telling us that if we get that we have gifts and we're confident in them, we have to do something about it. We have to act. It's not an insult. It's not a soft-handed insult to say, oh yeah, you just stare at your face all day. That's an insult, straight up. And I use this term spiritual obesity sometimes because it's when I or anyone I know consumes all the time, and we sit on the knowledge that we have. What God has called us to is to embrace that we have gifts, that we should be confident in those things, and we have to get out and act. Because to sit on that knowledge would be the worst thing you could possibly do as a Christian. It's having the hope of the world on your lips and at your fingertips, and you deny people because you're scared and because you're afraid of being uncomfortable. It's the worst thing we could do. But all of this lack of action in our lives stems from insecurity. Inaction with our gifts stems from insecurity in ourselves and with God. But being action-oriented means that we know how to handle doesn't mean that we'll know how to handle every situation. It does mean that we'll probably make mistakes, but it means that we're willing to step into the insecurity and trusting God's ability to guide us in the process. And the reason we can trust God with our insecurity is because he's already taken care of our eternity. We trust him with the insecurity in our life because he's handled our eternity. More than 2,000 years ago, Jesus lived a perfect life. He was a real man. He said, I'm the way, the truth, and life. I'm the way that you can have a relationship with God. And the religious leaders at the time were not cool with it. So they killed him on a cross. And he's the only religious figure in human history to say, I'm the way, and then prove it by coming back to life. And that's why we take him seriously. And in the process of all the things that he did for us on the cross and coming back to life, he made a way for us to have a relationship with God, not just when we die, but starting today. So in just a minute, we're going to celebrate how Jesus changed our reality by taking communion. We're going to pass a tray down your row with a stack of cups that'll have a cracker and some juice representing Jesus' body and his blood that was broken on the cross. And we'll eat and drink together as the band plays in just a minute. But if we embrace what Jesus did for us and know that what Christ did on the cross can give us confidence in what he wants to do in our lives, that frees us to act even when we're insecure. And the reason I can say that is because I've gotten to see it work firsthand. I've gotten to see people whose lives would not have been changed had someone not acted. I led a growth group last fall, and there's a guy in my group named Mike. He's a big guy, not the Mike from the video, another Mike. And he's real big, real jacked, real tall. And I learned in my growth group that Mike loves three things. He loves God, he loves his wife, and he loves lifting weights. And I hope it's in that order. I'm pretty sure it is. But that's Mike. And I learned that Mike really wanted to grow in his faith. And so he came up to me one day, and he said, J-Mo, you give me some Jesus, I'll give you some shoulders. And I was like, all right. Because, I'm pretty skinny now, but I was really skinny like a year ago. And so we decided to start lifting weights together. And more importantly, we talked about what did it mean to have a relationship with God? What did it mean to have gifts and use them? And it just, all these things started coming up. And I realized that Mike was kind of a jacked up dude. Like, he's kind of messed up. He got shot at during a drug transaction in Baltimore. He beat up a drill sergeant in the military, got kicked out of the military. He's done some really weird things, and he's kind of a character. But Mike, even though he is messed up, he acknowledges it, and he's humble enough to recognize when Jesus wants to work on him. And I love that about him. There are some times where we'll have a little scuffle together because we're great friends now, but he always comes back with humility. And one thing I learned about Mike, too, was that he's got the gift of encouragement and communication and evangelism, I think. And I got to see him invite, I'm not exaggerating, dozens of people from our gym. Some of you may be here today because Mike invited you from our gym. And Mike just got really solid gifts. He knew what his gifts were, and he was pretty confident in them. But this mountain of a man turned into a mouse every time I asked him about his wife, Catherine. She's like 5 foot nothing, maybe 100 pounds. But Catherine didn't have a relationship with God, and Mike did. And he was terrified to talk to her. For months, I would kind of work with Mike and try to encourage him to have a conversation. He just felt completely unequipped. He had no vocabulary for having a conversation with his wife about Jesus. And a couple months ago, he got approved to go on our missions trip to Ireland. And so Mike was pumped to use his gifts to go overseas and impact people who didn't yet know God. But we realized the day before he left, Mike, you're about to go across the Atlantic Ocean to reach people with the gospel, but there's someone in your own living room that you haven't talked to about Jesus yet. And so that night I worked with him and tried to use my my gift of evangelism to work with him and empower him to have a conversation with Catherine. And even though he was terrified, he went home that night and asked Catherine, do you believe Jesus is who he says he is? And do you want to give your life to him? And that night, Catherine, with tears in her eyes, looked up at her husband and said, of course I do. And he texted me saying she had been waiting for me to step up this whole time. And on July 20th, Catherine got in that tub, declared Jesus the leader and forgiver of her life, and entered into a relationship with God. And I don't know about you, but come on. Mike had nothing to be afraid of. He knew what his gifts were. He was confident in them, but he didn't act. And some of you here, you came here hoping that God would be able to do something for you, and all I've been talking about is how God wants you to help other people. I want you to know if you're here and you're hurting and you're broken, Jesus is the source of rest in your life, unequivocally. But as we see in the Bible, people who bump into Jesus never just sit there. They're always challenged to turn around and go impact other people. And I want you to know that if you're hurting and broken today, Jesus is where you'll find rest. But don't let being messed up stop you from using your gifts. Mike is messed up. I love him to death, but he's messed up. He's been sober for 15 years, but he'll call himself an alcoholic. And he's got half a dozen other demons that he's just one bad decision away from letting them all back into his life. But he didn't let his insecurity keep him from acting and using his gifts. And so I don't want you to disqualify yourself from having an impact with the gifts God's given you, because God doesn't disqualify you. You're messed up? Me too. We're all messed up. This is Mosaic we're talking about. But God's called you and given you a gift for a unique calling where you can impact people in your world that only you can do. And I don't know about you, but that is the greatest thing, I think, ever. That I've been given a gift, that I have a unique impact, and that even when I'm insecure, I can step into it knowing that Christ went before me and that there's a good work he wants me to be a part of. Pray with me, please. God, I'm really thankful that I don't have to be perfect to get to be a part of the purpose you have for me in my life. And for anyone here who doesn't know what gifts you've given them, God, I pray that you'd make it clear, that they would be intentional and spend time with you to know how you've equipped them to make an impact. And God, for those of us, myself included, that are trying to have gifts that you just didn't give us, make us confident in knowing that there are things that we don't even know that you've called us to be a part of because of the gifts you've given us. And ultimately, God, all this does not matter if it wasn't for your Son and the fact that he came back to life and made a way for us to have a relationship with you. So for anyone here who hasn't put their trust in you, God, I pray that they would seek you, that they'd be humble as they learn what it means to know you, and that they'd be willing to step in to the moments of insecurity so that you can do something amazing in their life. We love you, Jesus. In your name I pray. Amen.